since the time that Richard Nixon went to China in 1972. And Tiananmen threatened really to totally rupture the relationship between China and the United States.
Despite international pleas, the government was ready to send in the troops.
So China declares martial law, and I didn't know what was going to happen. They'd never done this before.
The reaction to the declaration was swift. The students abandoned their hunger strike and prepared for a crackdown. Meanwhile, as troop transports entered the city on the night of the 19th of May, the enraged citizens of Beijing blocked major intersections, preventing the troops from entering the square. It was no longer just a student protest. It was a citywide revolt. Shocked by the outpouring of emotion against martial law, the government withdrew its troops to the suburbs and tried to shore up its base.
And it was another extraordinarily cathartic moment. And it led the people who were part of this movement, this populist movement in the city, to believe that they were perhaps more invincible than they turned out to be. Because nothing like this had happened since the Chinese Communist Party took power. They had never met such popular resistance and never been thwarted, never suffered the indignity of being challenged and defeated in the middle of their own capital by ordinary people.
Meanwhile, as the city of Beijing rejoiced, the mood in the square turned sour.
You know, there we were, students in the early 20s, have every good intention to help the country, and did everything to sacrifice ourselves for that purposes. But all of a sudden, what we got from the government response was escalating threat. This is completely out of our control. We don't know how to deal with this.
Students passionately debated whether or not to leave the square and head off a violent conflict. Though they demanded more democracy from the government, the students were unclear how democracy worked.
So what was democracy? People didn't know. At one point the students thought they should end the hunger strike. They thought they weren't getting anywhere. But then they had a vote. And they didn't understand that, you know, it just takes a majority. They thought that, oh, that's no good. Everybody has to vote to leave. Many student leaders said it's time to leave the square. You know, the army's all around us. Let's just get out of here. But the problem at Tiananmen Square was new students were coming every day. They were arriving by train. They heard about it. They got off the train. They were all excited.
The situation in the square became increasingly chaotic, and soon the leadership was outstripped by newer, more radical elements.
There came a moment when these more moderate, reasonable student leaders were eclipsed, and there were a different group that came, quote, to power. And one of the lines that was taken was that, you know, until the square is washed with blood, China really won't understand. You know, we have to bring out the worst in the party to make the country understand how violent and how authoritarian they actually are. And that set up a very bad dynamic where there could be no further compromise.
On the 29th of May 1989, a new icon graced Tiananmen Square. Students from the Art Academy erected the Goddess of Democracy, a pure white figure clutching a flame with two hands, staring directly at the portrait of Mao on the Forbidden City.
I think, you know, when Goddess of Democracy appeared on Tiananmen Square, that was probably the most memorable moment of my entire Tiananmen demonstration experiences.
Meanwhile, Li Peng and fellow hardliners orchestrated a decisive, violent end to the crisis. In recently released government transcripts from a meeting on the 3rd of June 1989, Li Peng stated, "We have to be absolutely firm in putting down this counter-revolutionary riot in the capital. We must be merciless. Security forces are authorized to use any means necessary to deal with people who interfere with the mission. What happens will be the responsibility of those who do not heed warnings and persist in testing the limits of the law."
I arrived in Beijing on what turned out to be the last international flight before the airport closed. And as soon as I got out of the plane, I could see there was something unusual.
That day, the city of Beijing seemed to hold its breath, preparing for the worst.
There was no customs or immigration official. We walked from the plane into the terminal, unaccompanied by any question, any interference, and got our own bags. And then at the curb, the taxi drivers refused my business. They said it's too dangerous. We can't go into the city.
That evening, the troops mobilized again. The stage was set for a massacre. On the 3rd of June 1989, over 50,000 troops along with armored personnel carriers entered the city from every direction. Just as on the day after martial law was declared, townspeople poured into the streets in an attempt to thwart the army.
They were told to not allow themselves to be stopped by anybody under any circumstance, and they came in with live ammunition, and they started shooting their way into the center of the city.
It was a very strange mood among people that they felt that there was some misunderstanding. They simply couldn't believe troops would open fire because the Chinese army is called People's Liberation Army. They couldn't believe the PLA opened fire at the peaceful demonstrators.
The streets of Beijing became killing fields. Most of the people that died that night were not in fact students, but outraged citizens in the wrong place at the wrong time.
All of a sudden I was pulled back. It turned out to be two of my relatives finding me in the middle of the street. And then the same moment I was pulled back, I heard a gunshot. I saw a girl that was standing behind me, fall flat on her back. And then people were running and screaming and all that. So I looked straight down her face, and there's blood and there's a hole on her forehead. I mean, I still think that bullet was meant for me.
Meanwhile, in the square, a sense of panic and confusion built.
And it wasn't very clear to us, where the massacre was really taking place. It appears that the massacre was taking place in all directions. Troops are coming from all directions into Tiananmen Square and killing people along the way.
I felt very helpless. And you see all these bodies coming out, and you see ambulances. And then you see there's not enough ambulances, so pedicab drivers are going in. And they're putting the bodies on the back of their pedicabs.
The closer the army came to the square, the firmer became the resistance from the townspeople.
A lot of civilians, they try to use their life, take the risks to stop the army. They didn't want the army reach the Tiananmen Square. They didn't want the army to kill the students on the Tiananmen Square.
1 a.m.